In this series of talks, Why I'm a Christian, I'm giving reasons for my faith. And for some people, those two words don't go together, like reason and faith. In fact, some people would say a reasonable faith is an oxymoron. And I want to suggest that, in fact, it's not. In fact, let me just start with a little story here, a little illustration of this. So my friend Bob is a pilot, and he's a really good pilot. And a couple years ago, I flew with Bob and a couple of our buddies to Oregon. 4 of us went. And I had absolutely no apprehension about flying with Bob. I knew that he had lots of hours as a pilot. I knew he was skilled. I knew that he every year goes and gets additional training. I knew he took extra precautions for safety's sake, right? So completely comfortable with Bob. I also know that planes can fly. Right? I mean, I've been on lots of planes. I got lots of experience there. I'm not worried about that. So I trusted my life with Bob and got on board that plane, and off we flew to Oregon. I exercised faith, but I want to suggest that it was faith that was based upon sufficient reason. Now, was it based on absolute certainty? No, of course not. Could Bob make a mistake? It happens, right? Do planes have mechanical failure sometimes? It happens, right? So I don't have absolute certainty, but I did have high probability, enough that I had sufficient reason to believe that we were going to get down to Oregon and back safely. No problem. Okay, so that was me. Now let me shift the image for just a minute and imagine Bob landing his plane in the bush somewhere in another country where people are unfamiliar with planes. They've never seen planes, they've never been on a plane, and they have no idea who Bob is. And Bob lands his plane there, and he speaks to a couple of them and gives them the opportunity to get in the plane and go flying with him. If they say yes to Bob, that will be a different kind of faith, won't it? Because they don't know anything about Bob, and they've never experienced a plane before. They won't have sufficient reason to get on that plane and fly, and probably many of them would not do it. So here's the question I want to ask you. Which kind of faith is it that God expects of us? Does God expect us to just ignore the nagging doubts and the perplexing questions and just believe, as some of us have been told? Or does God invite us to examine the evidence and make a reasonable choice to believe? Is Christian faith, a leap into the dark, a suspension of intelligence and reason? Or is it more like my flight with Bob? I want to suggest that Christian faith is based upon compelling and adequate, though not absolutely certain, reasons. So here's the good news, and I think it's pretty good news. You can be a Christian without checking your brain at the door today. That's good news, friends. And here's why. Because I often say this, that the heart cannot rejoice in what the head cannot accept. You are not going to be really excited about something if in your head you're constantly doubting that it's real or that it's true. And I want to tell you today that many brilliant people have found the Christian faith to be satisfying, not just spiritually, but intellectually as well. I've compiled a limited bibliography for this series, and if you want to dig a little deeper into any of the subjects we're talking about, I'll send you to our website or our app. You can find that bibliography there, and there's lots of reading to be done. So here's the big idea for today, though. Top of your outline, big idea. I'm a Christian because there's compelling evidence for the faith. The Christian faith rests on the reliability of the Bible and the resurrection of Jesus. And there's good evidence for both. Here are 2 subjects that I want to tackle because these 2 subjects, really, the Christian faith rises or falls on these 2 things. Is the Bible historically reliable? Is it reporting what really happened? Or did someone just make this stuff up and write it down? Or has it been changed over the years? And then did the resurrection of Jesus really happen? Because the Apostle Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians 15, if it didn't, then friends, he says, there's no Christian faith. So we're going to look at these 2 things, the evidence for each. Before we dive into that, I'll invite the ushers to come. And if you brought an offering today or your tithe, thank you again for your generosity. I believe we have a little slide up there, don't we, for giving. If you want to, you can text. Look at that, it says giving is easy. Friends, you have no idea how easy it is. Just ask your neighbor if you can borrow their phone. And then give like you've always wanted to. Thank you for your generosity. All right, while we're giving, let's go ahead and dive right into this talk. Are you ready? Okay, first I better tell you something. Last night when the service ended, I do a little eval with a team, and some of the team said, oh my word, the little outline you give us, there's just not enough room to write all this stuff down. It was dense. There was a lot of information. And one of them said, this was like drinking from a fire hydrant. And so I'm just giving you fair warning, all right? I'm going to come at you hard and fast with a lot of data, a lot of information. It is going to be like drinking from a fire hydrant. If you're drowning, just turn to your neighbor and say, quick, pull me out. But we'll do the best we can. All right, here we go. So number one, let's start by talking about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to examine 3 lines of evidence with you. Here's the first one, letter A. The body was gone. The evidence of the empty tomb. The body was gone. So the resurrection story in the 4 Gospels begins with some women visiting the burial site of Jesus on Sunday morning to finish the job of embalming his body. When they arrived, they were dumbfounded to find that the stone had been moved away and the body of Jesus was missing. The women ran back to their group and reported this to the men, Luke 24:11. But they, the men, did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like what? Like nonsense. Friends, I just want to ask you, if you saw a friend of yours killed, and then you went and saw him buried, and then a couple days later someone said, hey, he's alive again, what would you think? Nonsense, right? This is crazy. This doesn't happen. When the women insisted that it was true, the men finally went to the tomb to investigate, and they found the tomb empty. Actually, the tomb wasn't completely empty because Jesus' grave clothes were still there. You see, they had wrapped Jesus' dead body with a linen shroud and had sprinkled 100 pounds of burial spices in it. And now the only thing in the tomb was this shroud lying there like a discarded cocoon, as though the dead body that was once inside it had simply evaporated, leaving it there. The body of Jesus was gone. All right, so what could this mean? First, let me say that the fact that the body's gone doesn't automatically mean that Jesus was raised from the dead. True? There are other potential explanations, so let's look at some of those. The first one that was put forward was that the disciples stole his body. This is the first and oldest theory. The disciples stole Jesus' body and then conspired to cover it up by spreading a fabricated story of a resurrection. This, by the way, was first proposed by the Jewish authorities who put Jesus to death. Matthew chapter 28, verse 11. While the women were on their way, that is, on their way back to their group to report that the tomb was empty, some of the guards who'd been watching the tomb went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you were to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. Let's pause for just a moment. Do you see a problem with that? Yeah, if you were truly asleep, how would you know what happened and who came? Yeah. If this report gets to the governor, they said, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and they did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Have you ever heard of fake news? So see, this is happening for a long, long time, right? Yeah, nothing new here. Well, Matthew's final remark indicates that he was refuting a widespread explanation of the resurrection. The Jewish officials were saying, hey, the disciples came and stole his body while we were sleeping. Some of you might have seen the movie about this, While You Were Sleeping. Just checking to see if you're still with me, all right? So here's the interesting thing, though. The official Jewish explanation of the empty tomb did not deny that the body was missing, that the tomb was empty, but attempted to explain it by saying the disciples stole the body. The very explanation presupposes that the body was missing and the tomb was empty. But there are huge problems with this. Why in the world would the disciples steal the body and lie about it? They had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose. In fact, each one of the disciples would end up suffering and dying for this message. And who do you know that willingly suffers and dies for something that they know to be a lie? People will suffer and die for something if they believe it's true. But if it's a lie that they've concocted themselves, highly unlikely. On top of that, a conspiracy is an incredibly difficult thing to pull off and to hold together. Chuck Colson, how many of you know who Chuck Colson was? Okay, all the high mileage units, thank you so much. I mentioned Chuck Colson to some of our young staff a couple weeks ago, and they gave me a blank stare. I said, Watergate? They shrugged. Chuck Colson was Richard Nixon. By the way, Richard Nixon was the president of the United States at the time. Just a little heads up there. So, Chuck Colson was Richard Nixon's hatchet man during the Watergate conspiracy, and Colson went to prison as a result of this. And he will tell you how difficult it is to sustain a conspiracy. In fact, the more people involved in the conspiracy, the more difficult, the more impossible it is to hold it together, because all it takes is just one person, right? One person cracks and tells the truth and you're in trouble. All of the disciples, I mean, here we've got the 11 disciples, we've got the women, we've got the 120 in the upper room. All these disciples faced torture and death for their belief in Jesus. Don't you think that at least one of them might have cracked somewhere along the line and said, okay, we're making it up. Didn't happen. So the disciples stole the body. Unlikely. Second suggestion, somebody else stole the body. Perhaps it was thieves. Maybe the Jewish or Roman authorities removed the body for safekeeping. But again, these run into the same problems. Why? What would possibly motivate the thieves to do that? And why? It's kind of crazy. Why would you leave the grave clothes behind? If you were a thief, why would you strip off the grave clothes and drag a naked body away and leave them spread out there? And if the authorities took it for safekeeping, well, this is pretty simple, because the authorities opposed the message of Jesus. They opposed the disciples as they spread it. And if, in fact, the authorities had removed the body and kept it for safekeeping, when the disciples started to spread the message of the resurrection across Jerusalem, what would the authorities have done? Simply produced the body, right? Said, hey guys, he's not resurrected. Look, here he is. And that didn't happen. Here's a third suggestion. Maybe the tomb was empty because Jesus didn't really die. Jesus wasn't dead. This is called the swoon theory. It suggests that Jesus was not dead when they removed him from the cross. He was just unconscious. And that somehow he revived in the tomb, managed to roll the stone aside, overcome the guards, escape, and convince his disciples that in fact he'd been raised from the dead. Well, this has got some real problems. First of all, it doesn't square with the data about what Jesus suffered, about his injuries and his torture. Highly unlikely that Jesus would have survived the beating, the crucifixion, the spear thrust into his heart, the entombment. J. Vernon McGee, anybody recognize that name? J. Vernon McGee, okay? Yeah, he's like this old, warhorse preacher for years and years. And a woman once wrote Dr. McGee and said, our preacher said that Jesus just swooned on the cross and that the disciples nursed him back to health. What do you think? Dr. McGee wrote back, dear sister, beat your preacher with a leather whip for 39 heavy strokes. Nail him to a cross. Hang him in the sun for 6 hours. Run a spear through his heart. Embalm him. Put him in a tomb for 3 days and see what happens. The extent of Jesus' injuries argue against the swoon theory. Besides that, you've got the fact that his executioners were experienced professionals. They knew what it was like to execute people. It's what they did. They believed he was dead, and just to make sure, they ran a spear through his side. Those who removed him from the cross and buried him believed he was dead. The women even wrapped his body, as I said, in linen mixed with 100 pounds of embalming spices. It would have required Houdini-like skills to escape from this. Even modern medicine believes Jesus was dead. In 1986, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, there was an article on the death of Jesus, 6 pages long, looked at all the evidence, and here was the conclusion. Modern medical interpretation of the historical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead when taken down from the cross. If Jesus had, in fact, only swooned and had resuscitated in the tomb and appeared to his followers, half dead and in need of serious medical attention, it certainly would not have evoked their worship of him as a resurrected Lord. If there's anything that's clear, they perceived Jesus as having triumphed over death, not having barely escaped it. Here's a fourth suggestion. Fourth thing that people have put forward saying, well, maybe you can explain the empty tomb this way. They went to the wrong tomb. True thing, and here's why. You ready for this? They say, well, it was the women. Right? Who went to the tomb first? It was the women, dazed with grief, confused in the darkness, and they went to the wrong tomb. Hold that thought, ladies, because I'm going to come back to it a little later. And you'll thank me. Trust me. Don't worry. So, yeah. The ladies just went to the wrong tomb. Well, there's a really obvious problem with this. Even if the ladies had gotten it wrong, there were lots of other people who knew where the right tomb was, right? Joseph of Arimathea, it was his tomb. He knew where it was. The Jewish and Roman authorities who had made sure that he was buried and who had posted a guard, they knew where the tomb was. All the other disciples, they all knew where the tomb was. It is preposterous to think that all of them got it wrong, that everybody went to the wrong tomb and no one remembered where the right one was. And then here's the fifth suggestion, and really, this is the big one. This is the one that is most common and most popular today, and I'll take some time to address this. That's number 5, that it's just a legend. A lot of people say, why even bother with all, argue all you want about all those other theories. The whole story is not to be taken seriously because it's just a religious myth, just a legend that was written generations after the purported events by people who were never there. As I said, this is the most common explanation, and it goes back to the issue, are the Gospels trustworthy? Are they trustworthy historical records, or are they just fabrications written generations after the fact? So I'm going to deal with this in the whole second point, so we'll kind of leave that for now, but I'll just tell you ahead of time that I believe there is plenty of good evidence to indicate that the Gospels are, in fact, reliable historical records. On that first Easter morning, the tomb was empty, the body was gone. But I think we all know, as I said earlier, that the fact that the body's missing doesn't prove a resurrection. To prove the resurrection, not only need a missing body and empty tomb, you need what? Appearances. People need to see him alive, and that's letter B. Letter B, the Lord was seen. The Lord was seen, the evidence of the resurrection appearances. So not only was the tomb empty and the body gone, but there were many people at many different times and places who reported seeing Jesus alive. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul lists the people that he knows personally who have seen Jesus alive. 1 Corinthians 15, starting at verse 3. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared. Let me pause there before we get into the names. The Apostle Paul here is quoting what many people think was the earliest form of a Christian creed, summarizing the Christian faith. And Paul says, here's the gospel, and he gives it to them in 2 couplets. He says, Christ died according to the Scriptures for our sins and was buried. So dead and buried. And Christ was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures and appeared to many. So dead and buried, raised and appeared. And as I said, this is kind of an early creedal statement that goes back to the very first days of the Christian faith. So who did he appear to? Paul says he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James, that's the brother of Jesus, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. Most scholars believe that the Apostle Paul wrote this only 15 to 20 years after Christ's death. He's writing to the Corinthian church that he established. And he seems, as I said, to be quoting a creedal statement that summarizes the Christian gospel dating back to the very first days. So here's something that is written during the lifetime of eyewitnesses. Here are the names of specific individuals and groups who saw Jesus, written at a time when people could go ask them and check it out if they wanted confirmation. And Paul even mentions, as we noted here, that he refers to 500 people who saw Jesus at one time and adds this little thing. He says, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. It's as if Paul were saying, look, you want to check this out? There are hundreds of people who saw Jesus alive. You don't have to take my word for it. Go ask them. The Gospels, the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul record many of these different appearances to a number of people in a variety of settings over a period of several weeks. We'll put a list up on the screen here and just run through some of these real quickly. We've got Mary Magdalene near the empty tomb. The other women, which we've already mentioned, as they left the empty tomb to run back and tell the disciples. Cleopas and another disciple on the road to Emmaus. There were 11 disciples and others in the room in Jerusalem. Another time, 10 disciples, this time without Thomas, in a locked house. A week later, Thomas and the other disciples are in a locked house. Jesus shows up. There were 7 disciples fishing on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples met with Jesus on a mountain in Galilee, the apostles at the Mount of Olives before his ascension, and then, of course, as we just read, over 500 people at once, James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul, also known as Paul the Apostle, on the road to Damascus. This, friends, is a wealth of sightings. All right, so real important here. This is not a fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure by 1 or 2 people like a Bigfoot sighting. This is another category altogether, right? Multiple appearances to numerous people, all confirmed by more than one source. And these people not only saw Jesus, but they talked to him, they ate with him, they touched him. So that raises the question now. Is there another way to explain these appearances other than supernatural, that Jesus was raised from the dead? Aren't there some natural explanations we can rely upon? Well, let's look at what's been suggested. First of all, some people have said the appearances are inventions. What does that mean? It means the disciples made it up. The disciples made it up. In other words, the disciples lied. But again, what did they have to gain? Every one of them suffered and died for this message. Liars usually don't make good martyrs. People may die for a lie if they sincerely believe it, but very few people will die for something that they know they made up that's a lie. And there were hundreds of people who saw Jesus alive. Again, for all of them to lie, for all of them to maintain this conspiracy, well, it would be a conspiracy unmatched in human history. Here's a second suggestion. People say, well, they weren't lying, but the appearances were hallucinations. How do you explain that the disciples touched and ate with this hallucination? Hallucinations don't account for the physical nature of the appearances. Also, how do you account for the number and various circumstances? Jesus didn't appear to just one person, but to many. Not just at one time, but many times. Not just in one place and circumstance, but in multiple places and varying circumstances. Jesus didn't appear just to individuals, but to groups. And here's the most interesting one, I think. Jesus didn't appear just to believers, but to unbelievers. Hallucinations cannot explain this. Also, hallucinations are not group experiences. They're very individual. They exist in the mind of the individual who's having them. There really is no such thing as a group hallucination. Now, I know some of you are thinking, wait a minute, I've heard of a thing called groupthink, right? Maybe this was groupthink. Maybe this was wish fulfillment. Here's the problem with that. If you understand the basic mindset of first century Judaism and even the Greco-Roman world that they were living in, you would know that none of the disciples were expecting a resurrection. Their theological upbringing would not have prepared them for this. In fact, all of them greeted the news of the resurrection with skepticism, with disbelief. Rather than expecting a resurrection, all of them were completely surprised by it. This was not wish fulfillment. And of course, what about the empty tomb? Hallucinations and wishful thinking don't account for that either, while the resurrection does. All right, so let's get to, here's the big one. The third objection. People say, well, the appearances, just like the empty tomb, or what? It's just more legend, right? Just more legend. And this, as I said, is the most common objection, the biggest, and we're going to, when we get to point 2 here in just a moment, we're going to take a look at the evidence. Are these sources credible? Are they accurate historical accounts of what actually happened? Or are they just legends that were written down generations later? The appearances of Jesus are best explained, as the Apostle Paul says, he was raised on the 3rd day and he appeared. And when he appeared, when the disciples saw him, that's what changed everything. I want to emphasize that. It was the resurrection and the appearance of Jesus that changed everything. And that's letter C, the third line of evidence we're going to look at. Here's the disciples were changed and the evidence of the origin of the Christian faith. You know, even the most skeptical scholars will admit that the first disciples really seemed to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and that belief was in fact the reason for the beginning of the Christian faith. Without this belief, take away belief in the resurrection, and Christianity would have never come into being. But here's the problem. How do you explain the origin of that belief? Something happened, right? Something happened to make these people think that Jesus was alive. What was it? Well, I want to suggest that the best explanation was simply the resurrection itself. Consider the following evidence. First of all, the disciples were changed. Think about this. After Jesus died, what adjectives would you use to describe the disciples? They were what? Cowards. They were certainly afraid, weren't they? They were hiding for their lives. They were confused. They were discouraged. They were defeated. And yet within a few weeks, they were completely transformed into fearless and bold witnesses who risked everything, including their lives, to tell people that Jesus was alive. What changed them? I think the best explanation is a resurrected Jesus. Or how about this? Consider the conversion of skeptics. For example, how do we explain the change in Thomas? Remember, Thomas stubbornly refused to believe even when all of his best friends told him they'd seen Jesus alive. Think about that. If all your best friends got together and said, here's what happened, it really happened, would you go, pfft, you're all crazy? Or if they're your best friends, you go, well, Thomas said, you're all crazy. I'm not going to believe it till I touch him with my own hands, till I see him with my own eyes. And of course, a week later, Jesus shows up. And what's Thomas do? He drops to his knees and he says, my Lord and my God. What changed Thomas? It was an appearance of Jesus. How about this one? I love this one. How do you explain the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus? All during Jesus' lifetime, James refused to believe in him. His own brother, he refused to believe in him. Now, this is not that hard to understand. Let me just ask a question. How many of you in the room have a brother? Let me see your hands if you have a brother. Hold them up loud. Hi, that's it, good. Okay, you got a brother. Let me ask you a question. What would you think if your brother came to you and said, I'm the Son of God? Not only that, you ought to believe in me, follow me. In fact, you ought to worship me. Can you kind of see James' predicament? Yeah? Okay, so let me ask you the next question. What would it take to convince you? What would it take to convince you that your brother's telling you the truth? Well, maybe if you saw your brother crucified, buried in a tomb, raised from the dead, and then he comes to you resurrected and says, see? Well, that would kind of be a mind changer, wouldn't it? How do we explain the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus? The best explanation is that he saw the resurrected Jesus. Or how about the conversion of Saul of Tarsus? Friends, this guy, Saul of Tarsus, was the Osama bin Laden of his day. He was an anti-Christian terrorist. His mission in life was hunting down, arresting, and killing Christians. And suddenly, one day, he does a 180. And the very message he's been trying to destroy, he is now boldly preaching in all the places where he'd been trying to destroy it. It was shocking. I mean, he went overnight from being Christianity's most fierce enemy to becoming its most passionate champion. And literally sacrificed everything, including his life, to spread this message that Jesus was alive. What changed him? Well, he says it himself. He says, what changed me was, I saw Jesus. I saw the resurrected Jesus. Well, then third, we've got this issue of the spread of the Christian faith across the Roman Empire. You know, shortly after the death of Jesus, the Christian message began to spread like wildfire in spite of fierce opposition. Now, I want to just have you think with me for a moment. If you were an alien looking down on planet Earth in the first century, right? So you had this big global perspective, and you could look down on Earth, and you could see the tiny, fledgling Christian movement just starting in Jerusalem and beginning to fan out. And at the same time, you could see the whole Roman Empire, mighty Rome with its beautiful buildings, its great armies spread across everywhere, its control of everything. If you could see those two things, and someone said, okay, which one do you think will still be around 500 years from now? Or 1,000 years from now? Or 2,000 years from now? If you were a betting person, where would you put your money? On Rome. Everybody would have bet on Rome. And yet here we are 2,000 years later. Rome is ancient history, and the Christian church numbers over 2 billion people around the world. And we name our sons Peter and Paul, and our dogs Caesar and Nero. How do we explain this phenomenon? Well, it was the resurrection of Jesus that transformed those disciples and propelled them across the known world with that message. The best explanation for the changed lives of the disciples and the origins of the Christian faith really is nothing less than the testimony of the resurrection of Jesus. But here's the deal. Here's the deal. All that I just said to you depends upon what? Right? I mean, this is where the story's found. All that evidence I just gave you, it's all in here. So how do we know this is true? How do we know that these things that are written down here really were written down by eyewitnesses and not just made up by people a couple hundred years later? How do we know? Well, that's what I'm going to tell you next. Everyone take a deep breath. Step back away from the fire hydrant for just a moment. Are you okay? Your brain's not on fire? Okay, let's go on to the next thing then. Ready? Number 2. Let's take just a few minutes. I'm not going to take long here, but I want to take a few minutes to give the evidence for the New Testament. And I want to start with a really common thing that I know many of you have heard. Have you ever heard someone say, "You can't trust the Bible"? The Bible was written by men, and besides, it's been changed over the years. And here's kind of the argument, the way people think, right? That whoever wrote this, like the New Testament, whoever wrote this stuff down a couple thousand years ago, well, they wrote it down, and then someone else copied it, and someone else copied it, and someone else copied it. And every time it got copied, it got changed a little bit more, and someone translated it, and that changed it, and then someone copied that, and that changed it, and so on. It's kind of like the old thing, right? If you measure a board and cut it, and you need 20 boards that size, what do? Well, you measure every single one and cut it, because if you use this board and mark and cut, and then use that second board to measure the third and cut, and use the third to measure the fourth, what happens by the time you get to 20? Yeah, they're all a little different, right? They're not the same. And people think, well, that's what happened to the New Testament. Someone wrote it down, copy, change, copy, change, copy, change, copy, change, and so on. And here's what I want to tell you. That's just not true. There is an entire field of biblical study called textual criticism that focuses on the transmission of the biblical text through the years. And it's fascinating stuff, and you can find more information about this on that bibliography I gave you. But here's the bottom. I'm going to just summarize it real quickly. We have tons of evidence, and I mean tons of evidence, that the Bible has been faithfully transmitted through the years. I'll just give you one little factoid as an example. Okay, ready? The New Testament has 184,590 words in the Greek. This is the Greek text, 184,590 words. So how many of these words do scholars say are questionable? That is, they go, we're not sure that was in the original writing. How many? The answer is about 400. That is 0.002%, meaning that we are confident about the other 99.998%. That's better than Ivory soap, folks. And here's the other thing. Of those 400 words that are in question, and by the way, I don't have this with me right now, but I have a number of Greek New Testaments, and the textual apparatus, that's what it's described as, are the notes. And so these 400 words would have a little letter by them, and you look down in the footnotes, and it would say, this particular word is not in these manuscripts, and would list the manuscripts. But it is in these manuscripts, and it would list the manuscripts. And so it lets you say, okay, is it in enough manuscripts that it warrants being in there or not? It's very scientific. But again, the point is, of these 400 contested words, not one of them affects any point of Christian teaching or practice. The point I'm making is that you can be very confident that the Bible that is in your lap right now, the Bible you hold in your hands, is an accurate version of what was originally written centuries ago. All right? Now again, there's a lot more we could say about that, but I'm going to move on very quickly to the last thing here, this idea of legend. So here's the big deal that's being purported right now. How many of you, what was the book of the movie? Dan Brown's book. Yeah, that one. Yeah. All right. The Da Vinci Code. Yeah. So Dan Brown kind of popularized this idea in popular culture through the book and the movie. The idea that the New Testament documents were written generations later, 2nd century, 3rd century, and they were written by church people who were using them to consolidate their power. And I just want to tell you that history does not back this idea up at all. That if you will do the historical legwork, you'll discover it's not true. And Pastor Tim Keller, in his wonderful book, The Reason for God, gives 3 reasons why you can be sure that the documents in your New Testament, and particularly the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were not written generations later. They're not legends, that they are accurate eyewitness historical accounts. And here are the 3 reasons, right? If you want to jot them down. Letter A, first one is the dating. The dating. The New Testament accounts about Jesus are written too early to be legends. All 4 Gospels were being circulated in the early church during the lives of the eyewitnesses. All of them are dated to within 30 to 50 years of Jesus' death. In other words, when these Gospels were written down and began to be read and shared in the churches, there were still many people alive, many people who could either verify or deny the story. You know, if you are writing something a lifetime or several lifetimes later, you can pretty much say whatever you want, right? Because there's no eyewitness to refute your story. But if you're writing when there are living eyewitnesses around you, then your story needs to be true or someone's going to correct you. So for example, a few months ago in a staff meeting, I very confidently, I don't even remember what we were talking about, but I very confidently said, in my 39 years here at Life Center, I can count on one hand the number of people we've had to fire. Well, a few days later, I was in a meeting with some of the staff, and one of them said, so Joe, how many people do you think we've actually fired? They said, let's just take the last 20 years, because that's how long they'd been there. How many in the last 20 years? I said 3, 4, maybe. And they said 11. And then they started reading me the names. Oh, yeah. Darn eyewitnesses. Right? I mean, if you're going to say something that covers a period of time, you better be accurate if there are people who've been there for that period of time. Luke, when he wrote his gospel, started out by insisting that there were eyewitnesses to what he wrote down. The Apostle Paul says the same thing about the resurrection. We read that in 1 Corinthians 15, right? He says, there are 500 people. Most of them are still living. Go ask them. Don't take my word for it. Go ask them. There simply was not enough time between the death of Jesus and the first written records of his story. There wasn't enough time for legend to accumulate. A.N. Sherwin-White, he's a respected Greek and Roman classical historian from Oxford University, said, it would have been without precedent anywhere in history for legend to have grown up that fast and significantly distorted the Gospels. Simply put, the Gospels were written too soon after the events. The eyewitnesses were still around. Here's the second thing, letter B, the contents. The contents, I love this particular point. The contents are too counterproductive to be legends. Okay, so remember the theory is the Gospels are written several lifetimes later by church leaders who wanted you to believe their particular view of things because it consolidated their power and built their movement. But the problem is the stuff that's written in these documents is actually counterproductive to that view. It just doesn't work. I'll give you a few examples here. Here's the first one. Remember I said the ladies were the first to the tomb? Yep. In all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus every time is a woman. Why is that a problem? Because in the ancient Roman, Greek, and Jewish worlds, women were not considered reliable witnesses. In fact, women were not even allowed to testify in court. Don't shoot me, I'm just the messenger, all right? But that's the point. So here's the deal. If you are writing the story, if you're making this story up, and you want people to believe your story, and you're trying to consolidate your power, who's the first person to see Jesus alive? A man, absolutely. Every time it should have been a man. And yet in every single gospel it's a woman. Why? Well, because that's what actually happened. And they're just reporting the facts, even though the facts were counterproductive to the culture that they were living in. Or let's go a little bit bigger than just that. The Gospels contain lots of things that would have been offensive or even ridiculous to people in the first several centuries. And I'm going to give you the two biggest ones of all. Remember, I just gave you the little couplet that Paul said, right? About here's the gospel, that Christ died for our sins and was buried, that Christ was raised and appeared. Here come the two biggest offenses of all. The first one is the cross. How many of you are wearing a cross today? Could I see your hands if you got a cross on? Okay. Lots of you. Yep. We wear crosses. And what's the cross a symbol of for us? Yeah, of Christ's death. And even more than that, it's a symbol of God's love, isn't it? That God loved us enough to send us. Is that what the cross represented in the first 4 centuries under Rome? Not at all. The cross was a symbol of torture and execution. It was a symbol of death. It was a symbol of oppression. The Romans used the cross as a threat to keep people in line because nobody wanted to be crucified. So for them, in those first few centuries, the cross was scandalous, shameful, humiliating, and offensive. And I'm just going to say it as bluntly as I can. If you were making this story up, no one would have ever thought of putting God on a cross. In fact, for centuries, the Romans mocked the Christians. They made fun of them because they worshiped a crucified God, which was absolute scandal, ridiculous. If you were making the story up to consolidate your power, is that how you would have written it? Let's see how we could reach the most Romans. Not a chance. Here's the second thing that was scandalous. You know what it was? It was the resurrection. No one would have made that up. And you know why? Here's why. In the first few centuries, the Mediterranean worldview was dominated by Greek philosophy. And resurrection was considered not just impossible, it was considered undesirable. Greek philosophy basically said matter is evil, spirit is good. And so the goal was to get your spirit where? Out of your body, right? Get your spirit or soul, set your spirit and soul free. The idea of coming back to re-inhabit your body was unthinkable. Who would do that? Why, after you've gotten free, would you go back? No one would do that. That's how they thought. And if you're making the story up to consolidate your power, to spread your message, no one would have ever, well, they were barking up the wrong tree. The best explanation for this and many other details like this is that they simply told the story as it happened. Here's the third thing, letter C. The third thing is the form of the Gospels. They're too detailed in their form to be legends. So a quick poll here. How many of you read novels? Let's see your hands. Okay, you're not as literate as the 9 o'clock, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so for all you novel readers, you are my people. I read novels. I enjoy. So here's the thing. If you read novels, you know that modern novels are very realistic, right? That's part of the deal. But this is unlike ancient legends. Ancient legends were written very, very differently. C.S. Lewis, the Oxford Don, this was actually his field. He was a professor of ancient and medieval literature, so this was his expertise. And he wrote this. He says, I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, and myths all my life. And I know what they are like. I know none of them are like this. That is, none of them are like the Gospels. Of the Gospel texts, there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage, that is, someone is simply telling the story as it happened, or else some unknown ancient writer without known predecessors or successors suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern 20th century novelistic, realistic narrative. The reader who doesn't see this has simply not learned how to read. All right, Lewis is being a little snarky with the last comment, but he's making a fine point. He says, I'm an expert on legends, and I'm telling you, these don't read like legends. They read like real history. Keller's point here and mine is simply that the Gospels are true. Okay, so let me wrap this up. So, can I prove to you that the New Testament is true? Can I prove that with absolute certainty? No. Again, we're back to the point, right, that Bob could make a mistake, the plane could have a mechanical failure. I can't prove that with absolute certainty. But is there reasonable evidence that could lead you to believe that it's true? I want to suggest there is. Can I prove that Jesus rose from the dead with absolute certainty? No, I cannot. But is there enough evidence to suggest that it's reasonable to believe that it happened? I believe that there is. I believe there's enough evidence to get in the plane and fly with Bob. Do you follow what I'm saying? There's enough evidence to do that reasonably. And yet for many people, the sticking point is so simple. It's just the fact that this is miraculous. They just can't get over that, right? It's like, Joe, give all the reasons in the world. Bottom line is, it still can't happen. It's a miracle. So I finish by quoting Keller here. Keller says, I sympathize with the person who says, so what? So what if I can't think of an alternative explanation for the resurrection? It just couldn't happen. It's impossible. Let's not forget, however, that first century people felt exactly the same way. They found the resurrection just as inconceivable as you do. The only way anyone embraced the resurrection back then was by letting the evidence challenge and change their worldview, their view of what was possible. They had just as much trouble with the claims of the resurrection as you, and yet the evidence, both the eyewitness accounts and the changed lives of Christ's followers, was simply overwhelming. So if Jesus rose from the dead, what are you going to do? I mean, I'm kind of reading this thing thinking, if this is true, right? If this is true, if Jesus really rose from the dead, if he really is who he said he is, then I really can't go, oh, that's a nice story, swell, and walk off. If Jesus is really who he said he is, if he really rose from the dead, then like Thomas, I feel like I've got to drop to my knees and say, my Lord and my God, I believe in you. I'll follow you. What do you want to do? Let's pray. Lord, I think maybe the worst thing we could do, maybe the very worst thing we could do is to say, I believe this, and then at the same time shrug and say, so what? If this is true, Lord, it changes everything. That's what happened for those first disciples. An encounter with the resurrected Jesus changed everything, starting with them. And I pray that happens to us. I pray that none of us, that no one in this room walks away indifferent, walks away with a shrug and a who cares. I pray that every single person comes to terms with this evidence and would say, well, if this is true, then I need to bow my knee. I need to accept Jesus as my Lord, my leader, and I need to begin to follow him. And I'm praying, Lord, that if there are people in the room that haven't said yes to Jesus, that this might be their moment today. That convinced by the evidence, they say there's enough there to believe, I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to say yes. Friends, while our eyes are closed and heads are bowed, that might be you I was just praying for. And if it is, and if you're ready to say yes to Jesus, here's what I want you to do. While heads are bowed and eyes are closed, would you do just the opposite? Would you open your eyes, lift your head, look right at me, and then wave your hand at me? And your waving is going to be your way of saying, Pastor Joe, that's me. I'm saying yes today. Good for you, sir. Good for you. Thank you. Back here, good. I see all three of you right back there. Thank you so much. Good. Right down here. Thank you, sir. Good for you. Don't let me miss you. Wave. Okay, good for you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Over here. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone else back here? Thanks. Thanks. And right here, thank you, dear. Good for you. Good for you. Lord, thank you for each one of these dear people all across the room who just made what I think is the smartest and best decision they'll ever make in their lives. Because this is the decision that, as I said, changes everything. When we say yes to you, Lord, it transforms our lives now and our lives forever. So thank you for each person who just said yes, and I pray that you'll help them take their next steps and keep moving in relationship with Jesus. I pray that in your name, Lord. Amen. Amen. I got one more talk next week. It's called It's a Wonderful Life. I'm going to tell you why following Jesus is the coolest thing ever. All right. See you then.